I'm Robert Mandelbaum, a judge of the Criminal Court of the City of New York. I'm here with Reddy, an attorney at Proskauer Rose. We both had the great good fortune to be law clerks to Chief Judge Judith S. Kaye, retired Chief Judge of the State of New York, and we're here today in Judge Kaye's offices at Skadden Arps to embark on her oral history as part of the Oral History Project of the Historical Society of the Courts of the State of New York.
My name is Reddy. I'm here today with Honorable Judith S. Kaye, former Chief Judge of the New York Court of Appeals. We are going to start our session with Chapter 1 of Judge Kaye's oral history, which is childhood and education.
Ready.
Ready?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so the big question is where to begin. Judge, would you like to begin with your grandparents? Would you like to go as far back as...
I think I'll begin with my parents. Both of them immigrants to the United States. My mother arrived as a young child from a town in Poland called Stawisk. And my father, oh my goodness, my father's arrival in the United States was much more, what is the word, exciting, interesting, intricate, nuanced. My father left his family as a teenager, quite as an adult almost, a town called Drohitchin, which is in what is now Belarus. This is something neither of my parents ever talked about, their background in Europe. They both obviously left because life was hardly luxurious and was in fact very difficult, and it was painful for them to talk about these subjects. You know, since my growing up years and since Roots, the publication of Roots and everyone's attention to their origins, I just feel so sad that we never pursued this chapter. I wish I knew more about my parents' background. Now, my mother was young when she arrived with her mother and her sisters. My grandfather had come earlier. He became a tailor here. I guess he had to save some money to bring his family. They lived on the Lower East Side, and the instant they were able to go to work, they went to work, never finished school. My grandfather died a young man, and I know life was difficult, and maybe the one thing I would mention that does stand out for me is that their name was Morris. Their last name was Morris. And I have the ship's documents on their arrival here, my mother and her sisters. I know the name was Morris. And when they arrived here in the United States, the immigration officer told them they could not have their last name because in this country, Morris is a first name, it's not a last name. Imagine that, they just took away somebody's name. Our names are so important to us for saying who we are. And they gave my grandmother the name Cohen because he was a member of the priestly, in Judaica, the different tribes, and so they had the name Cohen. The irony is that a couple of years later, his younger brother arrived in the United States and he got to keep the name Morris. So a large part of our family is named Morris and a large part of our family is named Cohen, but they took their name, the immigration people took their name away. I remember that. Now my dad, I don't know where to begin with my dad. I never knew so many things. I was born in the year 1938 in Monticello, New York. Actually, I lived in Maplewood, New York, outside of Monticello. And it was a long time later that I learned that my birth, my father being a farmer, were factors that contributed to his remaining in the United States because my father came to the United States illegally. I guess I had seen every now and then in the family album photos of my father in Havana, Cuba, selling ties. I said I didn't ask the questions. I knew they never wanted to talk about it, but apparently he was deported, caught and deported. I don't have one of those ship's things about my father. He was apparently caught and deported to Havana, Cuba, which tells me that he arrived from Havana, Cuba, as many Jewish people did back then in the early 30s. So he spent a number of years in Havana. I'm very eager to go to Havana. I just want to. I feel no attachment to Poland, which is where both of my parents were born. Poland, I don't feel any connection to Poland because my parents essentially were driven from Poland. My brother went back there once and took some photographs both of Stavisk and of Drohichen. There are the mass plots where Jews were just shot, all of them in one place, and I'm confident many members of my family are there. But my father lived several years in Havana, Cuba, succeeded in coming back to the United States. I thought he came from Havana, but years later, when we were going to do something relating to naturalization at the Court of Appeals, I called the county clerk in Sullivan County to ask for a copy of my parents' naturalization papers. George Cook got them out. He said, "Do you know what your father's last country of residence was?" I said, "Sure, Cuba." He said, "Wrong, Panama." So apparently my father had more difficulties even than I knew. But somehow, years after my birth, again, he must have been found. This time he was a farmer. This time he had an American child, that was me, and lo and behold, he became a naturalized citizen of the United States. So that's a very long answer to your question, Anne, but that tells you about my parents, at least something about my parents, about their passion about the United States of America, especially my father, both ardent citizens of this great country and believers above all in democracy and education and working hard. I think those words would characterize them.
Well, so your mother arrived quite a bit earlier than your father, with her 3 sisters.
Yes.
Is that correct? And then I think there's an interesting story as to how they eventually met. Is that right?
Yes, I think so. Well, again, I don't have a lot of facts. We just didn't hang around talking about the good old days. My father and his brother, at the time he had 2 brothers who made it to the United States. Actually, he had a 3rd brother who made it to the United States, and that was a photograph we had in our little family album. I never recognized him, didn't know who he was. It turned out there's a photograph of him with a young girl in our family album. He was, in fact, deported and sent back to Drohichen, and he was exterminated by the Nazis, so I did never get to meet him. But my father and his 2 brothers went up to the Monticello area. I think probably there were health reasons, because this was known as the mountains. Honest, I never saw a mountain in the area of Monticello. But they got up to Maplewood, which is a couple of miles out of Monticello. You go up one hill, and then you go up another hill, and then you go up a 3rd hill. And they had a farm called Smith Brothers Farm. It was a real farm. It had a huge barn with cows. It had chicken coops. It had vegetable gardens. And it had a few what we called bungalows, which I in later life came to understand to be cottages in the fancier places. In the summer, meaning July and August, people would come up, and a lot of people from Drohichen and Stavisk would come up and rent those bungalows. And actually, I think somehow that's how my mother and father came to know one another. I think my mother's family somehow found its way to that bungalow colony and my mother met my father there. And so she came from New York City, where she was working, as I've said earlier, from the time she was old enough to look like she was allowed to work. I think the age maybe was 14 or something. I never knew anybody's ages or birthdays. That's another tradition. We never marked birthdays. And I think that probably goes back to the fact that they were sneaking in as employable. You know, it was important for all of them to work the instant they could work because they needed the money. So nobody marked a birthday. I can hardly remember having, I had a birthday party when I was 1 year old, had a birthday party when I was 15. But it wasn't until I married my husband, Stephen, that I recognized that as a time people celebrate and that we are truthful about our age. Although when I passed 70, I was sorry I didn't kind of cheat a little bit, get a couple of extra years.
So your mother's name was?
My mother's name was Lena. They called her Lee. And my father's name was Ben, coincidentally also. And it brings tears to my eyes, my grandson's name.
And they met, what year?
And your husband's name.
And my husband's name.
Yes.
And what year, so they met up in Maplewood?
Yes.
In the bungalow community?
In the summer, at the bungalow
Right.
colony, right.
And around what year was that, do you recall?
I would say I was born in 1938, so I would think not too far before that.
And your father was occupied at that point as a farmer?
My father was a genuine farmer, and my father absolutely loved the soil, and that was the life that he loved, and that's how I remember my father at the farm, although those years didn't last all that long. And I think it was kind of, it was a very marginal sort of existence where we eked out our lives. And what's interesting is that my brother is 4 years younger than I, and I discovered only a few years ago that each of us separately made our way to the farm many times, thinking that maybe we would have it back. Because we both felt such a bond to the place, the place of our origin.
So did either of your parents finish high school or have?
No, not at all. No, they neither of them finished school.
So at the time you were born, you were on your mother and father were both working on the farm, and then your brother came along, and that was 4 years after you were born?
That's correct.
And what year? Can you give us some dates for your birth date was 19?
My birthday's August 4th, the same day as President Barack Obama, and my brother was born June 21st, 4 years later.
And after he was born, how long did you stay on the farm?
Well, the thing that marks it for me and enables me to tell the story accurately is my birthday, as you've heard, is August 4. I started school when I was 5 years old, so that would have been probably late August, early September, I would say. And that absolutely, that would have been kindergarten. And I've gone to great schools, the Monticello High School, Barnard College, New York University School of Law. Unquestionably, the finest year of my entire educational life was spent at a one-room schoolhouse in Maplewood, New York. I entered when I was 5 years old. I remember the teacher, Miss Kitts. I remember her ringing the school bell every morning, and we had certainly a dozen or maybe a little more than a dozen kids in that school of every imaginable age. I can hardly remember the day-to-day. I don't purport to, but I do. The thing that stands out for me is that at the end of that year, probably August, my parents decided no longer to be farmers, that they would move into the Big Apple, Monticello, New York. And they opened a store in Monticello called Smith's General Dry Goods Store. I remember being tested at the time after 1 year at the one-room schoolhouse in Maplewood, New York, and I was placed in the 3rd grade. So it's clear that 1 year at the one-room schoolhouse was definitely my best year ever. Obviously, I learned everything that a 3rd grader needs to know in just 1 year. So when I was 6 years old, I entered the 3rd grade at the local Monticello school. So that's how I remember when we moved into town and into Smith's General Dry Goods Store. We lived over the store in an apartment.
So before we leave the farm for the city,
Yes.
Monticello, do you have any recollection of your parents socializing or having any leisure activity whatsoever?
I'll carry it forward all the way to the end. I never have any recollection of my parents socializing or having any leisure activity, whatever. I remember in our entire lives having one vacation together. The 4 of us, my parents, my brother, and I went off to Atlantic City. I don't know why Atlantic City, but that's the only vacation I remember. Not that we didn't have a great life. I had a great life. It just, I hope I'm giving you the flavor of what it was like. It was very, very work-oriented. I learned the ethic of work and family. We were a close family. My grandmother and my mother's 2 sisters would come up to Monticello. I told you the Drohichen people. In fact, one family I remember very well was Ralph Lauren and his family. They were from Drohichen, the town that my father came from. And there were summers that we, after my parents' farm was sold, when we were still young, we would be sent, my brother and I, with my grandmother, to a bungalow, and very often with the family of Ralph then Lifshitz, and his mother and father and brothers and sister. So there wasn't any leisure, there weren't any vacations, but I had a very, very good life. I did.
So again, before we leave the farm, I must go back to, I guess fast forward to a ceremony that was held.
Oh yes, that was absolutely terrific. I told you what the farm means in my life, and it's home. But some years ago, the wonderful people in Sullivan County decided that they would put up a road sign at the farm. And that was pretty great. I have to give you a secret that I've never revealed before, which is that I wrote the stuff that's on the road sign about my mother and father. It's about my mother and father. And my brother, who became senior vice president of Sony Music Corporation, which is a story in itself since he was such a bum, a total, complete, absolute bum. But he rose through the ranks. He was a musician, and although a serious musician, he went off the charts for some years, but fortunately he came back and rose from his artist management company to a record company, to CBS, and then to Sony Music. And I think we're both examples of the American dream, absolutely. But that ceremony was so terrific. Some of people came from the Court of Appeals. The local legislators came. But the high school chorus actually sang, and I mean, it was the best. It was so schmaltzy, so wonderful, and I have photographs of my grandchildren playing in front of the barn. The barn is the barn my father built. It still stands there. Regrettably, now there are so many bungalows that it became impossible. We couldn't. Neither my brother nor I could see purchasing that place and having, with all those bungalows on it. But the house that we lived in still stands, the barn still stands, the chicken coop still stands, and it was so great to see all my family and my friends and my colleagues assembled on what will always be our farm.
And I know that you had received some kind of a token.
Oh yes, that's right. Thank you for reminding me, Anne. A lady gave me the school bell. Yeah, can you believe that? Is that wonderful? I cherish that school bell. In fact, it probably needs to be polished, but I'm not touching it. I'm leaving it exactly as it is, and it's very proudly displayed in my home. I remember Miss Kitts ringing the school bell. I do.
So you went from how many students in the one-room school?
Oh, I think the whole school couldn't have had more than a dozen of them. I went to a huge school, which probably had 20 kids in the class, in the one class, in the third grade. And I remember at the time we had these two sets of, we had the A class and the B class, and I was put into 3B. I can understand that they were worried about me, but that was, from then on I went into the A class, to 4A and onward at the Monticello School.
So 1 year of kindergarten.
1 year of kindergarten.
Reading at the third grade level.
And math, and just think of all the things you need at the third grade level.
I think I recall you telling me that your grandmother used to speak Yiddish.
Oh yes, and that's something I could tell you and would enjoy telling you about those summers, something very precious about those summers. Now you have to understand that as soon as I was tall enough to reach the countertop, I would be conscripted for work at the store. And you know that I'm 5 feet 9 inches tall, so it didn't take all that long for me to become tall enough to reach the counter at the store. There weren't that many summers away, but when we went for the summer, my brother and I, so that my parents could work without any responsibilities for us, it was my grandmother who took us. My grandmother essentially was Yiddish speaking. She She never learned to read or write English. She did speak some English. And with my grandmother, I came to know the joys of Yiddish. My grandmother and my Aunt Libby would come up there. She was from Drohichen too, with my cousin Marty, and that's when I learned whatever Yiddish I did learn. It's just such a joy to speak it, and it always is in there. And especially that the need to learn Yiddish became mandatory for me, because whenever my parents didn't want us to understand what they were saying to one another, they spoke Yiddish. Now, I don't understand why my brother never learned Yiddish, but as far as I was concerned, it was absolutely necessary to know everything they were saying to one another. And just a couple of months ago, in the mail, I received an announcement about the Yiddish Theater, which I really haven't kept up with. There was a production down at 25th Street, I think, and 2nd Avenue, and it started like at 10 or 10:30. I went. It was fantastic. A little sad because, for two reasons. First of all, I discovered I was understanding only about 50%. They did do simultaneous translation. And second of all, I worry that this is a dying language. There was a very nice young man who, for about a half hour before the production, gave a little Yiddish class, and there were maybe, 20 people there, and he took us through a little bit of Yiddish. But I'm worried that it's quick disappearing, and it's really a pity.
So you had a relatively miraculous verbal and language skills at a very, very early age. And you took that from the one-room schoolhouse. And did you continue at the Maplewood School and the Maplewood High School?
Oh, you mean the Monticello? Now you're talking. Let's call it just the Big Apple, okay?
Big Apple.
Because it was a village, which meant that we were about 4,000 people. Now this is big compared to Monticello, compared to Maplewood. So I was in the city when I was in Monticello.
So it was Monticello Grammar School and then Monticello High School?
Yes. Yes.
And you continued to develop those skills?
I guess so. I somehow was drawn to journalism. Everything, of course, is so personal, isn't it? It's always one human being who changes your life. And I guess I would have to say that the one person at the Monticello School who probably picked his people, I became his homeroom student. I became an addicted Latin student, loved Latin. He was the Latin teacher. And I became a ferocious debater because he was also the debate coach. So that was very important in my life. But somehow, I gravitated to the newspaper. It was called the Monty Prince, Printz. I wonder what it's called today. But I began to love journalism. And I remember having my own column at the time, which was, you're not going to go back and look for this, are you?
Yeah.
Which was interviews with people. I really enjoyed doing that. I did regular interviews with people. And lo and behold, I became the editor-in-chief of the Monty Prince, which, not bad. At the same time, I was debating, studying Latin, and I also took Spanish, which I enjoyed very much. And you're right, I never associated my love of language and skill in language and love of words with that year with Miss Kitts at the one-room schoolhouse in Maplewood, New York.
Well, it is pretty miraculous to go from kindergarten to reading at a third grade level. So during this time, I know that your parents had no leisure time. Did you have any time to devote to outside interests?
Well, I don't know what would be outside interests. I remember being interviewed recently on a program which is about to come up soon called Mad About Music. And I was told to pick some opera pieces, which I did, and the wonderful interviewer, I think Gilbert Kaplan is his name, great program, QXR, just love to listen to it, asked me whether that's where I got my love of opera, and I had to hold my sides and, not roll on the floor with it. No, there was not a lot of opera in Monticello, so I don't know what you consider outside interests, because if you think of debating and travel, the debate team traveled. We went to big cities like Liberty, New York, and Roscoe, New York, and Fallsburg, New York, and we were on the road. And of course, basketball. I didn't play basketball. I don't know. No, I'm not much of a sports person. I like it, but I don't play it. So that took up a lot of my time. But I don't remember anything beyond that.
Did religion play a part of your family life?
Yes, in a sense, we were distinctly Jewish people. And what was very interesting about Monticello in all my growing up years is that in the summers, and now by summer I mean from the July 4th weekend to the Labor Day weekend, basically 2 months, July and August, Monticello was overridden. It was very much a Jewish town in the sense that the hotels, the Concord, Grossinger's, all of those places drew so many people. And it had a distinctly Jewish flavor, and I will never forget, when I was working in the store, seeing many customers who would come to the store with numbers written on their arms. People who were from the concentration camps. There were just a lot of Jewish people in Monticello in the summer. Once Labor Day passed, it became the ultimate Christian community. I just have the picture of the main street and the churches at either end and snowbanks and it was and I'm really talking about numbers of people. The Jews were definitely a minority community in Monticello, New York. We always belonged to an Orthodox congregation. I have to say, well, my mother kept a kosher home. That's how I grew up, and I did that myself after I was married. And we belonged to an Orthodox congregation, which meant the women sat upstairs. And what I especially remember is the day of fasting, Yom Kippur. All the women sat upstairs and just talked about cooking and food. Religion. I always was very conscious of being a Jewish person growing up. We had certain rules, like call it the modified American plan. For example, our store was open on Saturday, the Sabbath, which meant we worked on the Sabbath, but I was not allowed to knit on the Sabbaths. So some rules we tried. I was aware of the difference of being a Jewish person.
So
and now that once you start down memory lane, it's hard to come off it. Another most unforgettable moment of my life, since we had a store, and I always loved Christmas. Christmas is just so wonderful, and I remember starting Hebrew school, and the rabbi asking what our favorite holiday was, and yeah, I did it. So I get reward points for being honest, and I guess I get a little demoted for being kind of insensitive, stupid, but anyway, I did say Christmas. And it is. I love Christmas. Love Christmas.
So what else sticks out about your high school memories? Anything before we get to your senior prom?
Can't remember in particular. I'm sure that tonight I'll remember a lot of things, but my senior prom, all I remember about that, and it really tells you things more about my father and mother than about me. And the thing that stands out for me most about my senior prom is that here was my father, a refugee from Europe, very heavy Jewish accent. He had been left-handed, born left-handed, and forced to become a right-handed person. Back then they did it. When I was in school, it was not a great thing to be a left-handed person. It was sort of a tiny, tiny, tiny disability. It was we used to have penmanship class, and it was really bad in penmanship class because you just, your hand would go over everything you had just written, and so it was those little circles that you used to have to make. And also, I always remember at exam time having to sit at the back of the class because I always keep my paper out, and that was obviously not a thing to do when you're taking exams for other people to see. So I used to have to sit at the back of the room. It was still different to be left-handed. But here was my father. He was a very tall man, and just wonderful. I told you about my dad, but he was an Eastern European immigrant. He was in his heart and soul a farmer, loved being a farmer, a person of the soil. When it was time for me to go to the senior prom, and by the way, our Smith's General Dry Goods store morphed into Smith's Apparel, a lady store. I don't think in my entire life I was ever allowed to buy anything retail, so long as we had the store. Everything had to be wholesale, or gotten through the store. My father a lot of salespeople would come to Monticello and they would buy things at the store, or we would come into New York City and go to the Lower East Side and buy merchandise, fill up the car with merchandise. But the store also was stocked in large part by my father coming to New York City and buying all the clothes that were sold in the store. How on earth did he do that? I just can't believe he had any. Where did he get a fashion sense? But he came back when there was the senior prom coming up in June, and my father came back with a dress, that fit me perfectly and was one of the most beautiful dresses I ever owned in my entire life. How did he do that? I don't know. But that's what I wore to the senior prom, and that's what I most remember about the senior prom.
And he surprised you with that dress.
He did, absolutely. And it was so beautiful. I remember it in great detail.
Blue organza.
Blue organza. See, word has gotten out. Mm-hmm.
So during those last years of high school, obviously you were thinking to the next step, thinking probably bigger than Monticello at that point.
Definitely. Out of Monticello is what I was thinking, basically, yes. And I think we were about 60 people in my high school graduating class. A large number of people. Now we're talking about the year 1954, the year of Brown against Board of Education. And I would say of my classmates, a good percentage did not go to college. Many of them stayed in Monticello. That would have been an acceptable option. Working in the phone company, working for Con Edison. That's not what my parents hoped I would do, but many of my classmates and friends did that. Then a very large number of them went to what was then called State Teachers College. I would say probably those who went to college mostly went to State Teachers College. And after that, everybody went either to Syracuse or to Cornell. Those were the two schools that Monticello High School people went to. So while I applied to Cornell and Syracuse, I knew that because everybody was doing it, that I was not going to do that. And I guess I told you I was by this time, a committed journalist. In fact, given my love of Spanish, I kind of thought maybe I'd go to South America or something that would really upset my parents. But I came to a conference. I didn't want to be mean to them. This is just part of growing up, I think. I came to a conference at Columbia School of Journalism, probably during my junior year, and I thought, my goodness, this is just the perfect place for me to be at the Columbia School of Journalism, which of course was a graduate school. But right across the street from Columbia School of Journalism was Barnard College. I don't think anybody from Monticello had ever gone to Barnard College. I haven't researched that. But that made Barnard College very attractive. Now, mind you, when I graduated from high school, I was 15 years old, thanks to the one-room schoolhouse in Maplewood. I was 15, but I was always, people always thought I was much older. Even when I tried to get into the movies at a child's rate, I used to have to carry my birth certificate. But anyway, I applied to Barnard College, and I also applied to Syracuse, and I'd say, honestly, I think I made plans to go to Syracuse, but I just was determined to go to Barnard College, which was upsetting to my parents for the reason that living on campus in New York City was not their idea. Now, I did turn 16 in August, but that was not their idea for a 16-year-old person living in the wilds of New York City. So we made a deal. We struck a deal that I would come to Barnard College, but I would my grandmother lived in the Bronx with her two daughters, and the deal we struck was that I would come to New York City, to Barnard College, but I would live with my grandmother in the Bronx. When you think about that today, the idea that instead of the security and safety of a dormitory and the rules of a dormitory, I would be commuting by subway up to the Bronx, I don't know, but I did it for a year. I lived with my grandmother. I determined at the end of that year that I would live in the dormitory, and the most curious, and I mean, so much is coincidental, synchronicity, serendipity, whatever you call it. My grandmother died that year, and I never had to tell her that I was not going to continue living with her. But I did enter my second year at Barnard College, living at Johnson Hall, which gave me a reward no one had contemplated, because when you lived at the dormitory at Barnard College, there were rules. There were a lot of rules. Johnson Hall was a place where graduate students lived, women, and transfer students, and kind of older mixed crowd. 2 floors of Johnson Hall, and I passed it just recently. I always look at it and think lovingly back to those days. 2 floors, the 7th and 8th floors, were reserved for Barnard College students. In fact, Rena Yerviller, a judge of the Unified Court System, she was Rena Katz, and she was living there too. But the rules at Johnson Hall were nothing compared to the rules at the Barnard College dormitory. I mean, like curfew was maybe 11 p.m. or something like that. Back then, you could really just pretty much write your own ticket. So I'm grateful to my parents for not letting me live at the Barnard dormitory for a year.
So when you first came to Barnard, did you have any kind of an orientation?
Yes. Oh, yes. Yes, we had back then. I wonder if they still do it. We had posture. We were tested for posture. Did they do things like that anymore? I don't know. It would have been a good thing for me, because given how tall I got so early in life, I always tended to just try to look like everybody else. But anyway, I do remember the posture test. But even more, I remember what was called a Rorschach test, which was given to all entering students. And I remember being seated next to a person. I always had this very curly hair that I couldn't control, and yearned for that kind of very intellectual, cultural look of just letting your hair hang loose, parted down the center, sort of hunched over a book or something. And that was what the person was sitting right next to me. And they showed this thing comes up on a screen, which I didn't have to agonize over. I knew it was a rooster, and I wrote rooster. And then I looked over at the paper next to me. This was not a competitive examination, and that person had written Dante's Inferno. So I didn't think I would last long at Barnard College, because that's what a lot of people looked like. I had no idea. First of all, I guess I knew what Dante's Inferno referred to, but I had no idea what it looked like. And something, I still don't know what Dante's Inferno looked like, but I did know that was a rooster. And I worried a lot about what life was going to be like at Barnard College, which, in fact, they complicated a little bit for me by allowing me, in my choice of electives, to take philosophy. Now, why on earth did some guidance person let a 16-year-old from Monticello, New York, sign up first semester for a course in philosophy? That was ludicrous, just ludicrous. I had I guess there were a couple of required courses, and I spent a long time agonizing over whether I would follow the path of Latin, which I loved, or whether I would follow the path of Spanish, which I loved. The Spanish department at Barnard College utterly captivated me. That was not just a language, that was a department, that was a way of life. There was so much outreach, and they were so welcoming and all. So I went down the path of Spanish and took Spanish all my years in college. But a great thing happened to me. I would have busted out of Barnard that first semester, no question about it. I could never have survived an exam in philosophy. I got the mumps during exam week. Just amazing how these things happen, isn't it? I definitely would have been back in Monticello, New York, but for the mumps. But the mumps, it was a little embarrassing, but definitely had only to look at me to have proof beyond all doubt. And so I missed all the exams. most especially, I didn't have to take that philosophy exam for, I think, 2 years. I took some other exams, and then we just parceled them out over exam periods over the next couple of years. I never would have made it through philosophy. I doubt that I could today at Barnard, but I do remember that.
And Barnard is an all-women's college.
Yes.
Right? Did you have any recollections of enjoying being at a school with only women? Did you have mainly women instructors?
Well, mostly I look back rather. I just can't know what I was feeling at the time. But when I look back, it is only with enormous gratitude to Barnard College. What a mistake it would have been for me to go to Syracuse University, given my age and relative utter lack of sophistication. And I can't imagine being placed in a huge campus like that, or Cornell. But at Barnard, I think the fact that it was a single-sex college, the fact that it was relatively small, very high standards, very individual-oriented. I told you about my adoption by the Spanish department. I just fit right in. And I hope I had those thoughts when I was there. I think I had a very enjoyable time at Barnard College.
What was the social or political environment like during those years?
Well, see, I was a newspaper person, and I only remember growing more radicalized as I got closer to graduation and was writing for the paper and all that. I remember I graduated in 1958. I remember going to see Fidel Castro. He was up here at the time, and I actually walked across the park and went to see him. I remember writing, I got to be the editor-in-chief of the newspaper. I remember writing editorials to upset the administration. I mean, I was hardly a barn burner, but I just was having my consciousness raised. And I remember the terrible ruckus when I recommended abolishing the mandatory food plan at Barnard, which didn't make any sense to me. And I think it's gone now, but I haven't checked lately. But I think I did okay at Barnard. 4 very good years.
So at this point, your family was well aware that you were pursuing journalism.
Absolutely. Not happy about it at all. But it was a lot better than what my brother was doing.
What was that?
Nothing good. I think he was with blood, sweat, and tears.
So, oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow. That's pretty interesting. At that point, you were envisioning graduating, and I assume you thought you were going to get out into the real world and take it by storm?
Absolutely. You know it. I was going to be a major, well, I thought because of my love of Spanish, and actually the major that I chose at Barnard College was not Spanish, but close to Spanish, and it was called Latin American Civilizations, or Latin American Areas, I don't remember which. And it had a particular allure for me because it enabled me also to take courses at Columbia. Remember, Barnard then was, as it remains to this day, a women's college, and there was Columbia across the street. When I became a Latin American Areas major, I could take courses at Columbia as well as Barnard. I studied Portuguese. I studied things about the Latin American civilizations that would not have been given at Barnard. And that just sharpened my desire to be a journalist, maybe traveling in Latin America. There were all kinds of interesting things going on in Latin America. I think I applied for a Fulbright. I think so. And I never got an answer, which leads me to think that it came to Monticello and that my parents destroyed it. That's the only explanation. You can't apply for a Fulbright and never get an answer, right? But I think I applied to go to Peru, which was a special interest of mine because of the ancient civilizations that I had studied a lot. But there I was with no Fulbright and no job. Went looking for a job as a newspaper reporter. So that was a pretty distressing time in my life. And ultimately, well, I traveled a lot around the eastern part of the United States in search of a job as a newspaper reporter. I had been what they called a stringer for the New York Herald Tribune at the time, which meant I reported campus news to the Herald Tribune. I used to go there every week and have a desk at the Herald Tribune where I wrote about things on campus. But they did not offer me permanent employment. It was very hard to get permanent employment as a journalist back in the year 1958. So I tried a lot, got a lot of rejections, and was miserable for a while until I finally took a job with the Hudson Dispatch of Union City, New Jersey. And that was right across the river. The job I ultimately took was not as a world shaper of opinion, writing about Latin American revolutions and ancient civilizations in Peru. The job I took was social reporter for the Hudson Dispatch of Union City, New Jersey, which was not what I had intended for myself.
So at this time, were you living in the city?
At this time, I was living in the city with my aunt. I made very little money. It was hard to... She had by this time moved into Manhattan. My grandmother had passed, and her sister as well. And so we lived together in Manhattan, and I would take the bus over from Port Authority over across the river to the Hudson Dispatch of Union City, New Jersey. And I guess I remember a couple of positive things, and I've searched my mind hard to remember positive things. Maybe best of all about the daily trip was that the newspaper was in the shadow of the burlesque theater. I don't know that everybody knows anymore what a burlesque theater is, but it was a very nice thought that I would imagine people thought I was going to work at the burlesque theater. I kind of enjoyed that. That was fun. I made a lot out of that. And the other thing I remember, and it's funny how these things stay in your mind, because this is 1958. I remember having to go to these women's club meetings. I reported weddings and church socials and all sorts of women's events. And I remember that they started every meeting, every women's club meeting, with what they called the club collect, which goes this way. It's, "Please God, keep us from pettiness. Let us be large in thought, in word, and in deed." That's how every meeting started. And you know, they never succeeded in doing that. But it got to be pretty grim going to the Hudson Dispatch of Union City, New Jersey, and reporting on all of these events. So I got the idea that I would go to law school. And I think actually I got the idea from reading about Tony Lewis, or reading maybe even some of his pieces, and learning that he went to the Yale Law School, but he never went to law school intending to be a lawyer, and he never completed law school. He just went to sharpen his skills as a journalist and to expose himself to legal things. And my goodness, he got to be reporting on the Supreme Court of the United States, writing for the New York Times. I thought, gee, I could do that. So I applied to the NYU Law School at night. At the time, they had an evening division. I was accepted. I'm sorry they've done away with the evening division, because we had such an interesting class of engineers and accountants, people who wanted to be patent lawyers, tax lawyers. We had police officers, a really interesting mixture of people. And I did that. I then left the Hudson Dispatch of Union City, New Jersey, and took a job with a feature syndicate here in Manhattan to make it easier for me to attend law school instead of commuting over to New Jersey. And so I took a job as an editor with a feature syndicate, which was a lot of fun. I got to edit a bridge column, which I remember with crystal clarity, since I have no idea how to play bridge and no interest in playing bridge. But I got to be very friendly with the guy who was writing the column. Scheinwald was his last name, and I think he was a big name in bridge. And he was always calling to thank me, because if he said somebody played a card and the person didn't have that card in his hand, or if somebody was supposed to have X number of cards and had Y number of cards, I could always point that out to him. And then there was somebody who wrote a fashion column who didn't know how to speak English, and so I could translate what he sent up from Mexico or someplace like that, so at General Feature Syndicate. So that was kind of fun, and I started law school at night at NYU Law School. I don't remember how many women we were, very, very few. Suddenly that got to be the nights were far more interesting than the days, ultimately, the switch.
Well, I was just going to say, let's save law school for chapter 2, and let me ask you just a few more things about how your family was perceiving this choice to attend law school at the time.
Well, it was definitely not their most favorite thing that I could do. I told you it would have been acceptable even if I stayed in Monticello. But that was lower on the list. That was definitely not their intention. Probably their number one priority would have been for me to be a teacher. They viewed that as God's work. I do too. And that would have been, they would have been so proud if I had become a teacher. The journalism thing, that was not something that had any interest for them at all. And as it turned out, I wasn't making any great success of it either. Law school would have been, wow. It was very hard for them to swallow that. And the reason was that I remember they're saying to me, nobody will marry you. And that was a big thing on the list at the time. In a small town where my high school classmates who stayed in Monticello, they were married and having babies, and the idea that I would be going to law school was, it was pretty preposterous in many circles at that time, but really not popular in Monticello, New York. And I have to tell you, in Monticello, the lawyers they were held in very high esteem, and I remember in particular one lawyer, Bernard Weiss, I know his son came ultimately to New York City to practice law. He used to be called Lawyer Weiss. That's what people thought about in Monticello. It was like Dr. Brakey and Lawyer Weiss. They were really valued individuals. So the idea of my going to law school and my practicing law was, not really high on their list. They would have preferred that I married and became a teacher in Monticello.
So we'll conclude with you were pursuing law in furtherance of journalism.
Absolutely, never with the intention of finishing law school or being a lawyer. Never. I think there was one lady lawyer in Monticello, maybe. I don't think I had ever met her at the time, but I didn't know any lady lawyers.
And you'd experienced a little bit of difficulty finding a job in journalism. Did you attribute that to gender, or at that point was it merely that you wanted to increase your skills through the law?
Well, I think it's just hard to get a job as a journalist. That's always been true. I think it's true to this day. It's definitely a profession that's hard to break into. It was particularly so for me as a woman, undoubtedly. A man would have had less difficulty than I did.
Right, well, thank you, and I look forward to continuing with law school.
I want to go back to one story from my growing up days in Monticello. And I don't know whether it fits better in birthdays or college, but it's kind of a little bit of both. I told you we never did anything about celebrating birthdays, and goodness, a birthday, August 4, it fell right in the middle of what we called the season. And my parents would just say to me on August 4, take something from the store, and I took something from the store every other day too, so there was nothing really very special about it. But there was something I really coveted in the store, and I just was too shy to take it, and it had no place in my life anyway. And it's what's called a peignoir. I hadn't, that's what they called it at the time. It's something you would buy for a bride. And it just was a pink fluffy thing with rhinestone buttons and stuff like that. And my parents did tell me that fateful year that I was going off to Barnard College, they told me that if that hadn't sold by the time I went to college, that I could take that with me to college. Now remember, I was going to live with my grandmother. That's clearly, would never have worn it around my grandmother. But for orientation week, all of the freshmen were at the dormitory at Barnard College, and I knew this would be just a knockout thing, a greeting for my new life at Barnard College. So I took it with me to Barnard, and another unforgettable moment of my life. The first night I was at the dormitory, I put on that peignoir and went to a meeting of the new freshmen and whatever they were doing to orient us, and I have never been so humiliated in my entire life. And that's when I learned that when you live at a dormitory, and I guess it's a women's college, but I guess that would be true of any college, what you do is get torn, old flannel things. The more torn and the older, the better. And you do not wear a wedding night peignoir into a meeting of incoming students at a women's college. And that is just one of the things. If I had to define lifelong things that made a lifelong impression, I would put that on the list, because never in my entire life, and I am now 73 years old, have I bought a beautiful piece of lingerie. Never.
Thank you.